So thanks everyone for joining us for day 2 of the Montana Organic Conference. I had several requests this year to have a session on carbon credits. And so Jeff Schahczenski with NCAT and Claire Lafave with Native Energy both agreed. And Claire is joined today by Colin Mitchell, who is a former NCAT employee, and Kirsten McKnight. I don't see Kirsten yet, but she may be joining us as well. So I am going to hand this over to Jeff, but first be thinking of questions. We hope to have a lively question and answer period after the brief presentations. So take it away, Jeff.
I am coming, hopefully. You see it. Are you seeing it? Just
yes, it looks good.
Confirm. Thank you. You never know when you're doing these things. Good morning. My name is Jeff Schahczenski. I'm with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. I'm an agricultural and natural resource economist. Although I'm a different kind of economist, as you will see. I characterize myself as a political economist because I have both my graduate degrees, one in political science and one in economics. So I have to blend them. So I'm a political economist. And I'm an institutionalist, which we don't need to go there, but it makes me a very different kind of economist than I think many people think of as economists. The dismal science, as they say. Okay. Now it won't, okay. This is very pertinent and recent, and I'm just going to put this out here. You can read it, and just keep this in mind as we go through. And that question I ask, hopefully by the end of this, which will be very short, it'll be interesting to discuss. This is not past legislation. This is in the United States Senate as we speak, but this is a significant program that will potentially address carbon sequestration because it will promote cover cropping, and it's a lot of money going to, across the United States if the Build Back Better bill passes. But I think that'll lead to some interesting discussions later. I am not a fan of carbon markets for many reasons that I'll make very clear to you. Partly, I'm old, and when you're old, you live through things many times, and I lived through the 2010, 2011 attempts to create a carbon market once in the United States that involved agriculture, and I watched it dismally fail. And many farmers were hurt in that failure. And I'm hopeful that the young folks that are going to talk next can figure out a better way to do this than we did at that time, because it never really amounted to much, and it is too bad, because if we could have moved to greater efforts to sequester carbon through agriculture, we wouldn't be as worse a predicament as we are in today. But there's really, I'm gonna call it 3 or 4 things that you have to always keep in mind when you're thinking about sequestering carbon in the soil. One is permanence. How long will that carbon remain sequestered? How long does it need to remain sequestered? I use 100 years is actually, I think the UN says it needs to be there and permanently sequestered for 100 years. I don't know why they picked 100. Then they can use the indigenous lore, and I think lore or idea, which is a good one, will last for 7 generations and maybe even more. Additionality is a primary problem that has always been, and that is, and I think of it as negative reinforcement, because if you think about it, what additionality means is that you have to do something new that changes from the status quo. So this is why fundamentally organic farming is kind of, and not so much ranching, but farming is kind of, I guess, be blatant screwed, because if you're already doing good things that sequester carbon, which all good organic farmers tend to do, they have to do something more to add to the things they're doing already. And so when carbon markets are set up, they're looking for people who haven't cover cropped. So they can begin to cover crop, and then they measure that sequestration, and that's additional. And that's then can be used to offset emissions from other sectors of the economy. So it's a fundamental problem for those who are already doing. So it's kind of like NRCS programs. I see it as negative reinforcement. In other words, if you're doing really good things, you can't get supported to keep doing them, except for one program, working lands program called the Conservation Stewardship Program. It's the only one that does that. But for generally in speaking, there's not been an accommodation to support those who are already doing good things. In other words, giving them positive reinforcement to keep doing the good things they're doing. Rather, they're looking for people who are doing things that aren't sequestering carbon and saying, okay, we'll pay you if you do X, Y, Z. Variability, verifiability. That's a bad word. Sorry about that. I went over this a million times, but verifiability. Can we actually verify that the carbon is actually sequestered and permanent and additional? And then can we continue to monitor that permanence and that additionality? Because if somebody does cover cropping for 3 years in a row, or does no-till for 5 years in a row, and then they rip their farm all up, then everything is gone, and we've gone nowhere. Nothing real has happened. And monitoring also adds an additional cost because someone has to be doing that. Even though I said I'm not that kind of economist, let's go to Economics 101. The condition, these are the things you'll get in 101 Ag Econ, anyone who's talking, but efficient markets, sometimes referred to as free markets, but we won't go there because that's a whole different hole to go down, but be economic competitive. Therefore, if you're going to have an efficient market system, you can't have oligopolies and monopolies. They're not allowed, otherwise it's not efficient because they have exercised economic power in a market that is not equal. Facilitate easy entry and exit from the market. So if I'm a farmer entering a carbon market, can I exit it if I want? Fortunately not, because of permanence and other issues. You often have to take long-term contracts and maintain that practice over time. So if you say, oh, today I will be a good carbon sequester, but tomorrow I don't want to be, you lose the benefit, and you have total freedom to exit and enter that market. I'll have perfect knowledge of what they are buying and selling. And I wish that was true, but as you will see, some of these are very complicated, and it's not so easy to know what exactly you're buying or selling. Both the buyer and sellers must have the ability, power to impact price. That kind of goes back to the first one. But if I'm offering something, if I'm a farmer and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to try cover crops, but I think it costs me $40 an acre to do cover crops, and I'm offering that to the market, the so-called market out there, but nobody says, no, I'm only going to give you 3. Then I can say, well, I'm not selling, and that would be, have the ability to impact price by offering and other people counter offering. But that kind of thing is not actually going on. So in a sense, we don't really have carbon markets yet. What is a carbon market? This is actually from that link is good, and you can read more on this, and it's a little bit too much verbiage on a slide. But it gives you, there's 2 kinds. They talk about compliance and voluntary. The only compliance market that I know that's really been successful and doesn't have very much ag issues, projects in it is the California climate market. That's a compliance market, and that essentially just is a way to ramp down. And of course, the state of California is involved in both setting and establishing that market. Voluntary markets, on the other hand, don't engage the government at all. They are not regulated by government to any extent, and this is, some people have started to calling this, and as you will see, there's many of these schemes, I will call them, instead of markets, popping up, and it's kind of a wild west. Everybody's offering different things and different kinds of commitments, and it gets very confusing very quickly about what actually is happening. And it's important to note that a lot of times the folks that are offering carbon credits, to say, are doing it because they essentially want to use agriculture's ability to sequester carbon as a way to offset their own pollution or their own emissions of greenhouse gases. In other words, rather than clean up their own issues, they'd say, okay, it's expensive for us to become like Microsoft, to be, carbon neutral. Let's buy some offsets from farmers. So in other words, farmers become the source of a way for them to avoid cleaning up their own house, in a sense. And I call these schemes. I don't really call them markets. And I don't mean scheme necessarily derogatory. They're schemes in the sense that somebody's offering something for something in return. This was in a AgriPulse, and I just put it in because it's Montana, and it's Bayer, which is formerly Monsanto, and Bayer is a huge agro. And they're offering these members $3 an acre on top of to pay for adoption of cover crops and no-till. But I also think it's kind of interesting that they're working again. They're trying to work with a cooperative. They're trying to essentially work with the people that they think will be their customers ultimately. And here's a nice slide. This is actually from the Cargill and the Regrow, and you can see, I believe they're in here. Where did I see that? Yeah, there's Native. They're a project developer, and they'll talk next. But these are the different players. They're constantly changing. It's very hard to keep up on them. But the buyers you see are people like Microsoft, Barclays Bank. Actually, that's interesting because it used to be in Belize. And then there's standards and verifiers. Remember, it has to be somebody that's third-party verifier. And then you got the farmers, of course, in this. And you got the service providers. These are people providing extra help to usually the ones that are offering the Indigos, the Cargills, the others. And this together, so it's different actors, different players, but essentially the sellers or the buyers are the Microsoft, the Barclays. They want to buy carbon offsets because they think they can basically get that at a lower cost, and they can do it by cleaning up their own carbon emissions. So they're going to do it, and these other people are involved in setting that up. I also work with the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy is also a great group that has a lot of information about this. And the National Sustainable Ag is a 130 member organization, and NCAT is a member of that, and they work on federal policy. And as a group, we essentially have come out saying that carbon markets are not a direction to go for the betterment of climate disruption in the future. And again, they state very clearly there's an inefficient solution. And the inefficiency goes back to my earlier comment, just basically on the efficiency of markets. First of all, they rely on measurement tools that are still under development. We can't actually verify well, even though it's getting better and better, the actual sequestration that occurs, and measure it accurately so that we know it's actually X amount going to stay there for X years, and somebody's going to monitor it forever so that it actually is real. They offer payments usually for a single kind of thing, like a cover crop or something that, and other approaches like EQIP, in particular CSP, offer positive incentives for people to do a collection. CSP in particular, it's a whole farm approach, and it gives you positive reinforcement to do the very similar things that a carbon market can do. Unnecessarily substitute additional market volatility. That's what happened to the Chicago Climate Exchange. It's speculative, it's inability to have enough volume of offsets for those demanding it. The market can get into a speculative frenzy, and it eventually crashed, and everybody was left holding the bag, so to speak. And I'm not sure that won't happen again. There's also a racial and economic inequality, because not all folks, not all farmers of all stripes and colors are equally able to access these markets. And I said organic farmers particularly aren't, because of the additionality issue. And they often use low payments for high quality. And here's an example of that, which I actually put together for this publication that NCAT produced. Currently, if you can get an EQIP contract, which is an issue, you can get $53.41 per acre to adopt that practice. But if you actually went to a carbon market to do that, they're only going to give you about $3.30 per acre. So obviously, it would seem to me, if you're a farmer, you'd want to get into the equip program, except it's very difficult and there's limited amount of funding. That's an issue in itself. But the point is they're offering significantly more benefit than at least some of the current carbon markets. And why have them at all? First of all, agriculture is not the major source of climate disruption. Probably is more accurate to say that it could be some part of the solution. How much the solution is debatable, but I think it can be part of the solution. But it's not really the cause of the problem. So why are we engaging, necessarily to create these markets for a problem? Not that we can't make that number maybe go down to 5%. With a lot of effort and good government policies and good reform programs to do so. But why isn't necessarily a market going to do any better? And why aren't we keeping our eye on the ball as to what really the sources of climate disruption are? And I would argue that reformed and improved NRCS working lands programs, particularly the CSP, would be a better investment of our money. So to begin with that that $5 billion that's being proposed currently in the Build Back Better bill, that $5 billion is at the expense. It is actually a lower allocation of money to the CSP program in the current bill, which is only about $4 billion. So in other words, we are creating a one-time program to offer cover crops, theoretically to address climate. It's $5 billion going out to any farmer, and we're not even sure if it's just going to those already doing cover cropping or those who adopt cover cropping. But wouldn't it make more sense to take that $5 billion, put it into a reformed CSP program that addresses climate, and we'd get a better result? Because we would be moving farms to a whole system, not singularly focusing on one particular practice like cover cropping, as beneficial as cover cropping might be. Finally, I just go, not everything in life should be necessarily put into a market framework. Carbon sequestration and carbon sequestration storage is only one of what they call ecosystem services that nature provides for us. I like the one here where it says spiritual health and cultural identity. I'd like to see a market for spiritual health and cultural identity, wouldn't you? And then we could all offer and buy, sell credits to become more spiritual or healthy. So it's not necessarily that a market is always the best solution to the issues that we are facing. So there's plenty of other resources that I have. This is coming out very soon. It's in formatting. And I think it's going to be a great update to a publication that's way too old. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with you all. And here's a couple other, this is the NCAT paper I was talking about, and people can access that later. And there's my contact information. And there's our actual website, which all that information can be found on. And then there's some nice little lammies make you happy. Thank you. And done for that. And look forward to questions.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Shall we hold questions until after Claire? I think so. Claire, welcome. Claire's with Native Energy, and we'll share a differing perspective.
I'm gonna share my screen. Is that showing up all right?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. I think there are a lot of legitimate, concerns and criticisms of the evolving carbon market and the agricultural carbon market. And I think, we agree with many of the things you said and disagree with some of them, and have found our way around some of them in a way that we think works and creates exciting opportunities. So I'm looking forward to the discussion that comes after this. So hi, everybody. I'm excited to share about what we do at Native. I I work at Native with an awesome team, two of whom are joining me today, which Jamie mentioned at the beginning. They can help with Q&A. So Kirsten has led the way on developing a number of our agricultural projects, and Colin previously worked with Jeff at NCAT and is now bringing his expertise providing technical assistance to farmers and ranchers to our team and projects. So really glad to have him and glad to have both of them here to help jump in on more specific details. So let me just see what's here. Okay, yeah, so we would love to hear your questions. So if you have anything that's top of mind at the moment about the carbon market, or anything Jeff said or anything you'd like to learn about, feel free to drop them in the chat now and we can kind of monitor them, and I can try to include them in the presentation, and then we can also try to make sure we get to them in the discussion afterwards. But it looks like there's nothing yet. So here's what I'll cover today. First, a quick introduction to Native, then a brief overview of the voluntary carbon market landscape. As Jeff mentioned, there's a compliance market, or there are multiple compliance markets. We play mostly in the voluntary carbon market, and that's what I'll be focusing on today. Then give you two project spotlights of two of our agricultural carbon projects and a little bit about how they work, and then time for Q&A. So who are we? We're a group of about 22 scientists, natural resource managers, and sustainable business professionals. We develop and sell climate intervention projects, and we focus mostly on developing carbon offset projects. Companies of all sizes support these projects as part of their strategy to meet their climate goals, and then some individuals support them as well. We've been around for 20 years, really since the inception of the voluntary carbon market. We focus on catalyzing new projects that create benefits that wouldn't happen without carbon financing. And we've been a B Corp since 2016. We have a unique model for how we develop carbon projects that we call Help Build. So with Help Build projects, we target project types with great co-benefits like climate-friendly agriculture that are blocked or stalled because due to some kind of funding gap. And then we gather upfront capital from companies with business models somehow connected to that landscape or supply shed in order to provide funding to on-the-ground stakeholders for the adoption of climate action interventions. And then over time, the carbon offsets, those reductions or removals of carbon associated with that intervention, are verified on behalf of those companies. So in this way, companies get to play a catalytic role in new climate projects, and project participants, like farmers, get upfront capital to help them cover the costs and the risks of transitioning to new practices. Okay, I see there are some questions. I think these are a little more specific. I think there's, in terms of sequestering carbon using alfalfa, I assume, depending on what practices you're using, I think that could be possible. We can talk more about that. And then Doug said, what about nitrogen? Why don't markets pay farmers to not use synthetic nitrogen? Nitrogen accounts for 80% of ag's carbon footprint. So they do. It depends on the project, but yeah. So a lot of the conversation around agricultural carbon markets has been focused on removals and through soil sequestration, but there are also projects that focus on reductions, which includes, nitrogen use reduction or nitrogen use optimization. And so in that way, for those projects, you would measure the baseline, the regular practices, and then quantify the reduction of emissions associated with the reduction or optimization of the use of nitrogen. All right, so let's see. I thought you might be interested in who would want to spend money on these projects. Here's a sampling of companies who have helped fund some of our projects. They often find value in supporting projects that are connected to their sourcing regions. For example, companies that use leather like Gucci choose to support our regenerative cattle ranching project, while companies like Ben & Jerry's support dairy biodigestion projects and cacao projects. We're far from the only player in this market, as Jeff demonstrated. The market includes a wide variety of developers, project types, project participants, and standard setters. So first of all, a sense of like all the different project types that are out there. And this is not completely exhaustive, but it gives you a sense of the variety. The carbon offsets can be anything from renewable energy projects to waste management to incentives for EV charging to the growth of new forests. So this is the larger world of carbon credits within which agricultural carbon credits sit. And for all of these project types, developers and auditors are quantifying the number of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that are being reduced or removed from the atmosphere, both on a yearly basis and throughout the lifetime of the project. So companies can then support projects by buying a specific number of tons that have been reduced or removed, or in the case of help build, that will be reduced or removed. So how do you know if it's legitimate? Jeff also touched on a few of these things, but when you're assessing a carbon offset project, the criteria you want to look for is, how is it measured? Is there credible physical sampling going on, or is there a credible calibrated model being used, or a combination of both? How is it assessing permanence of that removal or reduction? There are different permanence periods for different projects. And then how are they ensuring that permanence? Is it unique? So to be credible, the credit needs to only be claimed by one entity once. Is it additional, meaning could this have happened but for the carbon financing that was provided? And then is it validated and verified to a credible standards setting body? And we can get back to some of the additionality questions because it is a really important topic to talk about, especially in the agricultural carbon market. With offset standards, additionality is really important because what people are paying for is is something that wouldn't have happened but for carbon financing. But when we look at different scope 3 markets or removal markets, there might be more flexibility for rewarding previous practices or something that isn't associated with a specific change. Okay, so who are the standards bodies? This is sort of another way to look at this. That Jeff showed one version. So there are the traditional carbon standards bodies. So in the traditional carbon offset market, these internationally approved carbon standards bodies such as Verra, Gold Standard, Climate Action Reserve, they create and approve protocols that act as guidance documents for project developers to follow. And then once those projects are fully developed, they're validated by a third-party auditor to ensure that they're following the rules of that specific protocol. And then the specific reduction or removal credits are verified by the third party on a regular basis and issued and retired on behalf of supporting companies, which is recorded publicly on the relevant standard bodies registry. So hopefully that's clarifying. I know there's a lot of lingo here and it takes a little while to get used to. So then in the agricultural carbon credit world, all of these registries have agricultural protocols that developers, including us, use. There are also new developers like Indigo Ag that are specifically focused just on agricultural carbon credit creation, but they're still using the traditional standard and protocol approach for creating carbon offsets. And then there are also other new developers that are creating their own protocols and markets and systems of verification of outcomes. So that's this sort of third bucket here. For example, ESMC, the Ecosystem Services Marketplace Consortium, and the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund are creating protocols for scope 3 emission reduction and removal. So what that means is they're developing systems for creating projects directly within a company's supply chain that companies that can then account for not as an offset, but as a direct reduction in their supply chain emissions. So these are new developers, they're innovative and trying to create new offerings for growers, but they're new to the carbon market, which means we recommend farmers who want to work with them do their research and proceed with care. So some questions you might want to ask before signing a contract might be, what are the eligibility requirements? So in some cases, a field wouldn't be eligible if you'd ever used the project practice or set of practices before. So if it's a project around cover cropping and you've cover cropped on that field before, then that field would not be eligible for the project. In other cases, it could be that you could have done that practice for the last 2 or 5 years. It could be that the project will actually reward you for the outcomes associated with that last 5 years. So that's really important to understand. What is the contract length? So contracts can be anywhere from 1 year to 30 years to 50 years. Having it be 1 year is great because there's flexibility, but having it be 50 years is great because it helps to ensure permanence. What practices are required? Some projects are very practice specific. Sometimes it's just one practice. Sometimes it's a whole suite of practices that are eligible. And sometimes it's really focused on sort of whatever outcomes you can achieve. And there's a lot of choice around what practices you use. What happens if there's a natural disaster that impacts performance? When are payments delivered? So in most cases, farmers are paid for the outcomes when they occurred, or when they occur and then are verified. Whereas, with our help build projects, we're really trying to help provide that upfront funding. So that's important to understand. And then who pays for soil sampling? That's a big upfront cost at the beginning of a project. And it's important to understand whether developers cover that cost or not. Okay, so finally, I'll briefly introduce you to 2 of our agricultural carbon projects to give you a sense of how they work. The first one is the Northern Great Plains Regenerative Grazing Project. This project enrolls Montana ranchers who wish to improve and increase their rotational grazing practices. So the intervention here is to increase the density and frequency of cattle movements between pastures, giving the grass more time to rest and regrow, increasing carbon inputs into the soil, and ultimately carbon accrual in the soil. This is a help build project in which we provide upfront financing to farmers to help cover the costs of transition, including costs of fencing, water infrastructure, increased labor, soil sampling, and training over the first 5 to 7 years. And then after that period, farmers receive annual payments associated with the amount of carbon accrued in the soil. So this is an offset project following Verra's Sustainable Grasslands Management Protocol. I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions. And then the next one is the Northern Great Plains Regenerative Oats Project. This is an earlier stage project working with farmers in North Dakota and Manitoba and Saskatchewan that produce oats in their rotations. This is a scope 3 supply chain project being developed for a specific brand that purchases oats in that region. And the practice interventions that are eligible are cover cropping, intercropping, no-till, cropland grazing, and nutrient management, or nitrogen reduction and optimization like we were just talking about. So I will stop there for now. Looking forward to having a discussion and hearing your questions. Thanks very much.
So I think Doug had a question about soil organic matter and why farmers can't be paid for that, because it's easy to measure and understand.
I could maybe help answer that, and Colin can chime in here. This is Kirsten from Native. I'm on the project development team. So they do get, so soil organic matter gets, actually measure the carbon within the organic matter and the percent carbon to then get calculated into carbon stocks. That gets measured and modeled out, so we can get credits based on modeled accruals. And then the projects are 20, 30 year in length. And then so we'll do periodic soil sampling every 5 to 10 years. So I don't know if that's a direct answer to the question. I don't know if Colin wants to chime in as well.
You're not unmuted.
Sorry, I was muted on the headphones. I think some people also, all of our buyers want to buy CO2 equivalents, and that's harder to glean from a soil organic matter. So directly measuring soil organic carbon stocks is how you get that CO2 equivalent. I think also that is how we measure that permanence change, is once you get to that finer particulate organic matter and that long-term carbon storage, that's how you get that permanence. And so you actually know that's permanent as well, because you can see fluxes in carbon stocks as well, just like you can organic matter. But I think once you get that permanent carbon sequestered, those fluxes aren't as dramatic. I know I'm speaking as a Texan with 100-degree summers and floods and snowstorms now. So those changes are much more variable in the soil organic matter from my standpoint.
And just to add, we understand that the challenge in soil sampling for farmers and ranchers, and as a project developer, that's, if the projects and the buyers require that rigor, and we require that rigor for actual verifiable carbon reductions, we take on that responsibility to do the soil sampling. That's not something that we ask of farmers or ranchers to do.
One of the reasons I ask that question is theoretically, at least, the organic standard requires certified producers to maintain or improve soil organic matter. And it's always been curious to me why we're not therefore required to sample and provide data for that. But to the extent that that standard is followed, which is a whole nother question, but it seems like if we are growing and building organic matter, we should also be sequestering carbon by those same practices, and that should be recognized in the marketplace.
And you are. So if you're building organic matter, you are increasing carbon stocks as well.
Well, yeah, and I would think that the point, what I think Colin was getting at, this is Jeff, I'm sorry, breaking in there, but is the stability of it, is that they're pushing for the carbon, because the carbon, this gets, like, for instance, biochar applied, it's something that's recalcitrant, something that will stay permanently in the soil for theoretically 100 years. And the thing is, Doug, and I've actually pushed many times on many things in organic conferences that there should be a, maybe 3 to 4 year sampling of organic farms to say, yes, you are at least stabilized your soil organic matter or soil carbon, if not improved it. And that would be great, I think, as a way to promote organic agriculture, to say, look, we put ourselves under this gun, and we're meeting that. And frankly, the difficulty of maintaining soil carbon and soil organic matter is so dependent on where you're located, soil type. I've been doing some work on cover cropping, and it's so variable across places. So it gets very complicated very quickly. about what's the underlying soil that you had, where was the base that you started from, where did you move, and what combination of things did it, and then you have to like come up and have either models or predictions, and all of them have error bars around them, and we're not certain. The point is, are we moving in the right direction? And that's why I think working lands programs are better. We can start looking at just, are we moving in the right general direction with the things we're doing? But this precision idea that we can actually accurately quantify this stuff in all these highly variable situations. And if they're not accurately measured and people are actually, you're giving somebody else, like Microsoft, the chance to say, I don't have to emit less carbon because the farmer's doing it for me. And they're even doing it at a lower cost than it would cost me to do it. And so you're giving them actually something real. But if it isn't really real, and if it isn't really measurable, and if it isn't really additional and permanent, then we're just playing a game. Then we're pretending. And that's kind of what happened to the Chicago Climate Exchange market. There was an underlying idea that those actual credits weren't really real. And once the gig was up, then the market collapsed. It collapsed for other reasons too, supply and demand, but that's kind of like how markets work when they get in panic situations, People are speculating, expecting the price to go up and down, and it became a nightmare. And I don't think we have necessarily solved that nightmare.
I don't know if this is the time for this discussion. Are there more presentations? But all right, well, I'll go ahead then. What happens if you have a contract to implement practices, grow more oats or cover crops or graze in a different manner, integrate grazing, whatever the practices are, you do all those things. And then instead of 11 inches, we get 2 inches of rain one year and we sample and our organic matter actually went down despite doing all the practices. And what if that happens 3 years in a row? That we're still doing all the things, but climate change overrides our efforts and we're actually not sequestering carbon.
We're taking the long view. It's sort of a general answer to that question. So if we're using the example of one of these case study projects, we have 20-year agreements with producers. And those 20-year agreements take into account what's commercially reasonable. We're also working on building in drought resistance funds into our agriculture programs to use that carbon revenue to sort of where, if we're looking back 20 years, we expect the periodic droughts to, that there's going to be a net benefit, and there's going to, we're going to be soil sampling every 5 to 10 years. And if there are dry years, then there's still going to be a net benefit. But if we're looking 20 years ahead and climate change is expected to, increase these droughts so that they're not historic, and, our models perhaps are not accounting for the length of droughts, then, we need to consider that too, and building in these resiliency funds. From a carbon market perspective, there's a lot of mechanisms that are deployed to mitigate the risks to buyers, or to generally, if we're claiming real verifiable additional carbon that wouldn't otherwise have been sequestered. And those are things like, for example, Verra has they call it their non-permanence fund buffer pool. So every single one of the projects that is validated and verified to the Verra standard has to conduct a non-permanence risk assessment. And one of the categories is the risk of drought or fire, or whether it's a forestry project or an agriculture project. And permanence. So if if it's leased land and there's no agreement on it, that also has would get a higher risk rating. So eventually you get this percentage discount that you have to take from your issued credits. And the riskier projects would have maybe a 30% discount of the issued credits would go into Verra's buffer pool account in case there's a reversal. Native also buffers credits on top of any sort of standard buffer, just to account for that and to build in things like resiliency funds. So, to answer your question from a model, for example, with our grazing project, we measure in year 1 in the baseline, and we'll measure every 5 to 10 years. In the interim, we're issuing credit based on modeled estimates, and we'll true up the model every 5 to 10 years. We are expecting, if there's lean years, that their accruals in other years, they'll still be a net benefit. But we have 30 years to essentially make up for lean, to what's the term, modulate that potential variability.
Kristen, I have a question with that same, when just catching it right that moment. If there is that reality of that variability, does that mean the farmer gets a variable payment?
The payments are based on modeled estimates, and the model takes into account, precipitation in any given year, temperature, and practices. So yes, every year will be based on what the practices were and what that year's precipitation and annual estimates could be. Yeah.
So there's no one, you don't get paid X dollars per acre for maintaining these things for the 20 years of the contract. It could be up and down throughout the entire contract.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways performance-based, in some ways climate-based. And I'm thinking specifically about our Northern Great Plains grazing project. We don't have cropping projects. Well, there is one in development in the Palouse, but really, it's project dependent, depending on what the risks are and what a farmer needs to change the practices. So that gets tailored to any individual project.
You brought up a really critical point that we've kind of run into in our exploration of these markets, and that is the topic of leased land and the tenure. As you probably know, anything longer than 2 or 3 years is difficult to achieve in leases. And believe me, we try really hard, and we have some that are 10 years, but even that, in our experience, has been inadequate to qualify for most of these programs. And I don't know, I think we have to get over that if you actually want to work with many farmers, because most of us lease some, if not most of our land. Yeah. And it's nearly impossible to get a lease that's more than 5 years for legitimate reasons on both sides. And there's got to be, I think Jeff addressed it initially in the ease of entry and exit has to be built in somehow. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that problem.
Yeah, lots of thoughts. I completely agree. Most of farming ranch land in the U.S. I don't know the exact number, but I think it's unfair to only be able to include deeded landowners into the project, these carbon projects. We have leased land in our grazing project. From there's a few different layers of how you think about it. The VERA standards for the project, that the VCS project does allow for leased land to be included in the project. And we worked out with VERA because they're struggling with this right now, and they have looked to us for guidance on it, that we can include handshake leases into the project. Native, then another layer of that is the risk that Native takes on as a project developer and project owner, in case that lease is not held by the operator that we're contracting with in future years. So that gets managed in our agreements with producers, and in the buffers that we take. There's a couple different layers. So we ask ranchers if they lease land, preferably to have those landowners sign what's called a Landowner Declaration, which is stating that they will keep that land as grassland for at least 30 years. It's a statement of public intent. There's no liens. It's not an easement. It's just they file it with the county clerk and they say, we're going to keep this as grassland and manage it for improved soil health. So that helps us have, and also helps VCS with that non-permanence risk assessment, have some assurance that there's some permanence related to this. And we also have preferably sign a carbon credit waiver to make sure they're acknowledging that the carbon accruals based on change management that the rancher that we're contracting with, those rights are getting transferred through them for those carbon accruals above what is there as carbon stock. So there's a couple different things that are not required, but that we prefer to have in place on leased land.
So I think maybe some other people were surprised to see that Xanterra, which has the concessions at the national parks, was one of the companies purchasing carbon offsets. And Max has a question about, what other, is Xanterra also tasked with purchasing local food so that it's less of a greenwashing situation and that they're actually supporting the farmers around them and ranchers?
I don't know if Claire knows this answer better than I do. I'm fairly certain that, I know through just talking with their director of sustainability that they do, I don't know if it's a mandate, but they do source a lot of their beef locally. And the reason why Xanterra was an early supporter of this project is so we've worked with Xanterra corporate, not the Xanterra Yellowstone, because they have a federal mandate, I think, to offset fossil fuel emissions at their concessions. So they've been working with us for a very long time to purchase our offsets for that. Separately, Xanterra Yellowstone, the director of sustainability there, is on the board of Western Sustainability Exchange. That's one of our partners with the Montana, the Northern Great Plains Grazing Project. And so that Xanterra then played a central, so we started working with WSE to put together this project. And Xanterra then, purchased credits from it early to get it, to get our first ranchers up and running. And they're also, so Western Sustainability Exchange works on certifying local producers to their sort of sustainably managed local sourcing standard that they have. I don't know if anyone here is familiar. I imagine they are with WSE's work. And so I know Xanterra Parks, the Yellowstone sources WSE certified beef. Does that answer the question?
Max, did you have further questions about that?
No, I just think it's interesting if you're going to get carbon credits for, grazing that's meeting the standards, you want to support, you could support those ranchers by buying their beef, not even just local, but the actual, livestock involved in sequestering the carbon. Would be an interesting loop, closed loop, but
it's one that I think Xanterra Yellowstone is interested in closing, and I think they do source the beef.
Yeah.
To what extent that?
Yeah. And I think it'd be true for all these projects. It'd be an interesting question. I mean, the Microsoft example that Jeff keeps bringing up, to really get true reduction of putting carbon in the atmosphere because of the way we do our economy, just offsetting destructive behavior is not going to be enough, so, but that's a whole different topic. But anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I want to bring up a question, and maybe anyone can answer or help me. I have, I started with the idea of the concept of a market, and a market should be also for price discovery. Right now, I've seen everything from $3 a ton for cover cropping, and I've seen estimates that for many things that carbon really should be valued at $150 a ton. So if you're, when you're a farmer, you watch the futures markets, organics a little harder, but you kind of get a sense for price discovery. People are offering and buying, selling, but these are schemes. There's just different entities saying, I'll pay this much for that. What do you think? I'll pay this much for that. What do you think? And I keep wondering, the people that are buying these credits, are they wanting them to be cheap? Because if they had to clean up their own houses, they'd have to spend more. So they're essentially, doing this on the back of farmers or ranchers, saying, we don't want to clean up our mess. We'd rather have you do the work for us. Or they would make the argument that somehow you can do it cheaper, therefore it's good for the overall economy because you can do it cheaper than I can. And therefore you do it instead of me, which then if nobody's keeping track of this because it's all voluntary, are we making progress or not? At least when I'm spending money with my taxpayer dollars with a reformed, I would say, conservation security program, conservation stewardship program, there's actually maybe too much bureaucracy and not enough transparency. But I know that there's standards. They have to meet those standards. They're watching the contract be fulfilled. They're getting paid for the contract. It's a third party verified in the sense it's not just some entity that says they are a verifier that I don't know. And so I guess is what is the price of carbon that is being discovered by these ag carbon markets? Because I don't know that there is any one anymore. And should we just wait around until we settle out on one and then decide to buy or to offer?
I just want to address the one thing we keep saying about companies not cleaning up their own acts. I think it's a fair critique with maybe some of these agriculture companies that are looking to see if they can, pay some farmers to change practices, and then, it potentially is a cheaper way for them to do it. And I think that to me is a newer version of all of this. Is like, and I would encourage, any producers that are considering, these carbon markets to really ask, like, what is the value and what are you offering? Are these long-term agreements? Is it an offset or is it a scope 3? So a lot of these companies are trying to make scope 3 emission reductions, and it's potentially less value. There's less of a commitment on the producer side for long-term permanence and change in practices, but there's also potentially less value there because you're not developing an offset that can be traded on these global markets. But generally speaking, Native's been developing carbon offset projects for 20 years. We've heard that scrutiny a lot. It's sort of, this is a license to emit. And it's just not true. The companies that we've worked with in all those years, they're doing everything that they can to clean up their own act. Carbon offsets are just a tool in the tool belt. And we readily acknowledge that there are a lot of other strategies that companies can and will pursue to reduce their own emissions. But the reality is for the past 20 years, we've lived in a fossil fuel economy. And if they're selling products and transporting their people, and there's often unavoidable carbon emissions, and there needs to be strategies and tools in tool belt to reduce that. So
what about an alternative like putting, one of my favorite ones is, I call it a pollution abatement fee. You can call it a tax. As fossil fuels are coming out of the ground, we tax them and they become more expensive, and that goes through the economy, and therefore it goes through the economy, and the economy sees that things that are based on fossil fuels cost more. Yes, there's going to be income distribution issues that have to be addressed because of that, but it is an alternative means. Its transaction costs are easier, it doesn't have all these confusing things. I think if you tax the fossil fuel industry at the point it's coming out of the ground, you'd have to only monitor 3,000 entities or something like that, and you would essentially have the same effect. You would cause carbon to be more expensive, and then the economy and the market would compensate. Therefore, things that are renewable become, why not that as an alternative? Why do we have to go down this carbon market way? Why is it so, and I know there's political issues of why that's true, but there are other ways to do this.
Jeff,
we have
I
some
noticed
questions.
that Eric Bergman has had his hand raised for quite some time. Maybe we need to adjust that.
And then Oli too.
Yeah, well, thank you. Everybody, I guess, I would just like to say I appreciate, the well-motivated and good work that, everybody here is doing, and this group likely. And I guess my comment, if you'll humor me, that is kind of what I'm gleaning here. It sort of reminds me, we sort of prefer what we perceive as a manageable complexity to an unmanageable simplicity. And, maybe I'm getting to what Jeff is speaking to. And again, just humoring me. I do think that, what the content, what we're talking about, the gravity and the urgency of, our life on Earth here is such that, there's infinite complexity in the world, but from that, we glean some principles, and we know some things to be true on function. And I do think this in particular probably is a role of government question, in that, trying to solve the climate challenge by fitting it into our economic model. I think, anyway, again, thanks, just commenting. I think we probably need to adjust the economic model to adapt to the gravity of the situation. And that probably is better done through governments where, there can be a simplified expectation of, tax and how farming is done, and then maybe test out our faith in the invisible hand at the market, with what people pay for food at the end of the day. Anyway, just a comment. And I think what I'm saying is I appreciate everybody's work and it's all worth doing. But I think Jeff's point that maybe leaning on this is more of a public challenge, and what we do together in the form of government, seems to me probably more likely to help solve the problem than the markets as they currently exist. Just an opinion. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Oli?
Yes, there's kind of a question that relates to the aspects of the cover crop situation that both Jeff and you guys have touched base on. Probably also to the oats project you got going out in Dakotas and up in Canada. So when you talk about cover crops and you talk about conventional farming practices, the common way of terminating a cover crop on the conventional side is using Roundup as a burn down. So in respect to the carbon credits, yes, it's definitely improving the soils, but you're also enhancing other practices that is not very sustainable, and you're using energy to produce Roundup. And also in Montana here, we are having issues with Roundup in the rainwater coming down, contaminating our fields, organically speaking. So it's my question is really, are you looking from that perspective of including a more bigger picture when you look at these projects you do on cover crops, into the issue of what's going on in DC of the $25 an acre for God knows how many acres? Is that an issue that is considered in that law-making process that's currently are being on the table right now? So it's kind of a question to both parties here. Thank you.
I'd like to respond to that because I brought it up in the Build Back Better, this $5 billion for cover crops up to 1,000 acres. At one level, as an economist, I would say you are now establishing a minimum price for carbon sequestration related to cover crops. What farmer in their right mind would enter into any other kind of agreement if they can get $25 from the government? By the way, that's going to be run by the Farm Service Agency and not the NRCS, which is also interesting twist on it to me. Which means I hate to say this, but I'm a bit fearful as to the quality of actually watching how that cover cropping is done, how long it is. It speaks, we don't really know the details. We know there's going to be $5 billion. They're saying $25 an acre, up to 1,000 acres. They're not saying whether it's new cover crops, old cover crops, or if there's going to be any requirements as to how the cover cropping is going to be done. And I know from the work I'm doing right now on a cover crop publication for ATRA that there's no simple answer to, how cover cropping is done given soil type in other parts of the country. So we would have, my fear is that we're going to think we're doing something. And again, cover cropping is not bad per se. But what Oli's talking about is would we be a life cycle analysis? In other words, if you use Roundup and other things, what's the energy cost, the carbon sequestration, component of that method of termination versus using grazing as termination versus, tillage as termination. All of those have to be factored in, and all those have to be factored in by different soil types and different parts and ecologies in the United States, which I'm fearful that the FSA is not going to do. And we're going to pretend that we're thinking we're solving the carbon problem by giving $25 an acre to everybody. And they're also by setting a minimum price. I mean, you're going to have a hard time selling somebody $3 an acre for established cover crop when the government's giving $5 billion out. Again, why not spend that $5 billion on, and CSP needs reform, but in a reform program that is monitored by the government, that doesn't have to necessarily measure precisely exactly, but is moving people through various practices, not a single practice, the whole farm towards a better level of climate friendliness, smartness, or improvement. That could be done. And yet we're wasting $5 billion on, which I'm afraid is going to end up being a boondoggle. I might get in trouble for saying that, but I'm very fearful of it, having watched government for 30 years.
I'm going to go to the chat and go back to Carl has a very specific question about, could food waste composting be a suitable method for generating carbon credits based on the methane that's diverted by managing the organics via aerobic and anaerobic landfill methods?
So yeah, I added two methodologies into the chat. Yes, there are methodologies for avoidance of methane emissions for transitioning food waste from landfill to composting.
Thanks. Becky, did you want to have your questions addressed?
Well, they may be unanswerable, but you could try.
Do you want to go ahead and ask? Or
I was just writing another one. Well, Kirsten did answer one question because she put in the link to the modeling. And then my other question was, this is another one that may make some people mad, but it seems like the setup described by Native Energy is at risk of essentially buffering payments to areas that may no longer be suitable for certain forms of agriculture as climate shifts proceed. Who decides? I mean, this is a problem that afflicts a lot of government farm programs, as well as a question about privately run carbon payments. But I think it's a tough question that we need to be honest with ourselves about.
Becky, what is the question? Is it that?
Well, I mean, you were talking about, some people were asking questions about, what Doug asked, for example, what happens if you have a few bad years and no rain? And you said, well, you take the long view and your models allow for some variability. But what if over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years, this no rain phenomenon becomes alarmingly chronic? Do we just keep paying farmers for doing the same thing, even though we can all agree that the same thing probably isn't workable anymore?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Natives in this situation where we, on the information at hand, we believe that
Kristen, you're coming in and out. We're losing your audio.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it's my scarf. Have you guys been able to hear me okay so far?
Yeah, that's better. Scarf helps.
So it's a great question, and Native has always just been in this, we're catalyst to change, and we believe that regenerative practices are, we want to drive forward that faster. Carbon markets are no, we're using carbon markets as a tool. So in 5 to 10 years, or the next time that we do a soil sampling for example, for the Northern Great Plains project, and there's been a drought for 5 years, and there's been no soil carbon accrual, we still have 20 years to not sell any more credits and to accrue that carbon. But what's important is that we paid farmers and ranchers for 5 years for improved grazing practices. And that matters to us more than it does having a 20-year carbon project. So we wouldn't know, to answer your question, if there's a prolonged drought and there's no carbon accruals based on these changing practices, which we think is pretty unlikely, then we stop making payments because we can't sell any more carbon, and we need to wait until we get that carbon accrued and we can measure that in the soil. So yeah, so the answer is no, we don't keep paying, but we did 5 years of payments and we're not going to ask for that money back.
So I guess I'm uncertain. Say you did 5 years of payments. Did the companies get 5 years of carbon credits?
Yep, they will. And if we don't ever get it from your project, from the project with these ranchers, then we have a buffer portfolio of credits from other projects that have overproduced that will deliver to those clients for the carbon that they purchase, so that they have those real reductions.
Randall has a question. Can state, federal, and tribal governments enter their lands into these agreements?
Speaking about our project, yes. So the BLM has been signing the Landowner Declarations and the carbon credit waivers for the ranches that we've been working with. We're on leased land for them. We don't yet have any state land. We can have the project on state land. We don't have them signed off. So it's possible, yes, but we haven't had those conversations with Montana, with the state. With the tribal land, that is much more complicated because it's trust or fee land. It's one of my goals to be able to include tribal land in the next year into the project. We have Johnny Bear Cub has been with Native for probably 15 years now. She's based up in the Fort Peck Reservation, and she's a lawyer. And so she understands the nuances and the challenges, but she's going to be crucial for us trying to include tribal land in the project.
Thanks, Kirsten. Doug, cover cropping alone are not the answer. I've seen recommendations that farmers use more nitrogen fertilizer to compensate for use or tie up of nitrogen by rye cover crops. No, nothing further.
Just commenting. I don't think we need to discuss that further.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Max has another question. Given the numbers of farmers here, we haven't talked much about carbon sequestration in farming rotations other than cover cropping and grazing. What is Natives learning from the OAT project?
Great. So the OAT project is very new. We haven't, we're just in the process of talking with farmers about designing the project, structuring the project in a way that will work for them. We haven't validated or verified the project yet. So Native so far has really been developing out our grazing program, and then we're working now on developing more cropping projects. But I can say, the practices that are part of the protocol are cover cropping, intercropping. So this would likely be intercropping peas for harvest alongside the oats. Cropland grazing, a lot of these farmers have cattle herds as well. No-till, which a lot of growers in the region already use no-till, but for some, there's some organic growers that have not adopted it yet. And of course, that's a challenge, but maybe an opportunity to have some extra funding for that. And then nutrient management. So we will have more to share on how that goes and what practices farmers are excited about adopting and what types of outcomes we see in a few years.
I actually have a question about the OAT project. One of the most valuable things that farmers are able to produce, in addition to crops and soil health, is data. And, with the OAT project, not only are you getting, the carbon credits as a product, but you're also having a grain product afterwards. What is to keep are there any restrictions on, like grain trading and knowing what that production and yield is? The sense that you're getting, what the yield is for that particular area.
I'll just butt in here really quick, but one of the issues I didn't highlight as much is many of these programs are I think are data collection fishing, and essentially, the Cargills and the others, they want that data and are almost willing to enter into these programs to get that data, and that data is very valuable to them. So I do think that's something you should look at in an agreement, is who has access to the data and where will the data be used.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Most, like a lot of projects will have privacy statements, and it will be part of the contract that farmers will sign how the data will be used and who will have access to it. With the Ecosystem Services Marketplace Consortium, this is a really important piece of the program for them. Buyers will not have access to the data other than the credits that they are buying. Yield and data will be especially important in these scope 3 markets as they're working on, I don't know if this is helpful to get into, but instead of a ton of carbon, they'll be quantifying emissions factors reductions. So how many emissions and removals are associated per volume of crop. So in that case, it is really important to have that yield information to be able to understand how the emissions are associated with the total volume of the crop. But that information isn't necessarily going to the buyer. They're just going to get that emissions factor.
Okay. John has a question.
Yeah, this brings up a whole lot of really interesting stuff. Who monitors the data agreement? Because we're looking at, okay, well, we have to have all of this monitoring of the carbon or whatever it is, organic matter in the soil, to verify all of that. Who's the third party that monitors the data collection and usage?
Well, I'll answer quickly, but I think it's an very important issue. And one of the reasons why NCAT, for instance, didn't support the Stabenow bill, which is passed the Senate, it's a climate bill, is because it really doesn't provide for true third-party verification of these schemes. And I know that the other answer will be that there are international third-party verifiers. And you guys are familiar with this with organics, in terms of, third-party verification of the processes and practices you go through. But it's important that it's truly third-party, that they truly are independent of the folks offering the things. And that's one of the reasons that was difficult, because it's a bit of, like I said, it's a bit of the Wild West out there. If there's no true third-party verifier of some of these things and monitoring this over long periods of time, mind you, which is not cheap, then we don't know the true outcomes of what we're getting. We might be heading in the right direction, but we will be pretending a certain kind of precision that we really don't have, and we also just have to be on it to make sure that they happen. Some of the early European climate markets, when they went back and did studies of them later, they found that like 50% of some of those supposed sequestration and emissions reductions were in fact fake and false, because nobody was monitoring. No one was carefully watching them. And I fear that we're going down the same road again. Again, I live too long, and then I see too many things happen over and over again.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And one other observation that I have is that once again, agriculture is in the position of considering what will you give me for this, without any requirements on and position, saying, okay, I'll consider being in a program like this, but here's what I need from you. And and that it's not just going to the elevator and or to the stockyard and saying, what are you going to give me for this stuff? And that's a habit that agriculture has been in for a long time. And so, I don't know exactly how to frame my concern here, but
we call that price takers, not price makers.
yeah,
It's very simple, and I think that's exactly the imbalance of power and economic power that I see here, is that we have people, the buyers, who are the price makers, and they're kind of playing the same game and expecting agriculture to be the price taker again, and have little power in negotiation about what that price is, because we really don't have a market where there's true offerings of buying and selling in the degree, because we have monopoly and oligopoly, and we don't have that status of actually an efficient economic market. That was my point, I think.
Okay, so we're at 20 minutes after the hour, and thanks everyone for lively discussion and lots of questions. Jeff and Claire, did you want to end with some closing words?
Sure, I'll answer. Buyer beware. So, I know I came out on the negative side of this, on the oppositional side. I am hoping there's a lot of private capital, and I'm glad that private capital is being used, hopefully, to push us in the better direction. And I hope that happens. But I guess I'm just going to end with, as a farmer, as a practical farmer, as an organic farmer in particular, the idea of additionality and some of these issues are going to be very important for you. And I would think about, is there a better way that we can reward positive behavior rather than trying to move those who aren't providing those benefits by buying them to be better behaviors rather than reinforcing good positive behavior, which I think most of the organic community already is done. They already have done these things for more reasons than just economic, and therefore they should be rewarded. Let's have a carbon market for just being a certified organic farmer or rancher. that should be worth something in and of itself. Isn't somebody can develop a market for that one, since we haven't for so many others? Anyway, too much soapboxing, but that's my comment.
And to you, Claire.
Sure. Yeah, thank you all for participating and asking your questions and being, thoughtful and critical about this evolving space. We are trying to figure out the best way to use this as one tool for both climate action and for supporting farmers for stewarding the land. I think, yes, vast reductions have to be a huge part of this. And most of the companies we work with have big reduction goals, but they see offsets as something they can support right now, because there isn't the regulatory support and then that we need. And so offsets are something that is an immediate tool. So yeah, I think I just put my email in the chat. So if anyone wants to sort of continue the conversation in any way, we're always happy to sort of be a sounding board. And thanks for the discussion.
Thanks very much, Jeff, Claire, Colin, and Kirsten, who's already left the event. Hopefully we'll see you all for our lunchtime session, which is Claim Jones talking about nutrient management on grain operations. So thanks again. The video will be posted in a few days, and hopefully we'll have all the slides up as well. So thanks very much.
Bye.
Great. Good